Good morning, everybody. This is Irma Grundling. I am acting as a research consultant for FSD Zambia. And I would just like, for those of you who have missed the launch of the geospatial mapping of all financial and other service access points in Zambia on the 11th of May, I would just like to take you through the slides of the presentation that we did during that launch. So first of all, I would just like to tell you a bit more about FSD Zambia. FSD Zambia was established in 2013 with DFID funding, and FSD Zambia is all about making financial markets work for everybody in Zambia, and it's about deepening and broadening the financial system to make sure that all Zambians have equal access to the financial services that they need to manage their money. One of the greatest obstacles that was faced by FSDZ when they started in 2013 is the lack of information about the services that are being provided to Zambians, and also about the services that they would like to use to manage their money. So from its inception, FSD has focused on collecting and disseminating information that would facilitate a better understanding of how to achieve their vision of making the financial market more accessible to all. So one of the key research projects that they are focused on was FinScope Zambia. It's the demand-side survey looking at how people generate an income or generate money, the money that they need to make a living, and also how they manage that money, what they use the money for, how do they provide for the future, etc. So the FinScope survey was conducted in 2005, 2009, and in 2015 again. And it gives us a very good understanding of the things that I've just spoken about, how people manage their money and what they do with their money and what kind of services they use. But one of the big problems that we had with the FinScope survey is that it did not give us a good enough understanding of geographical access to service points. In other words, where are the population in relation to financial services access points? So to address this information need, we implemented the geospatial mapping project, mapping all access points of financial services in Zambia. So the objectives of this project or this exercise was, as I said, to gain a better understanding of current levels of access to financial service points. And to identify areas where we have gaps. In other words, where we have concentrations of population, but where there are no financial access points or service access points. So, and then what we wanted to also, the other question that we wanted to answer when we looked at these access points was to identify whether there are opportunities to use other existing service access points to address the gaps where we don't have financial service access point. So what we decided to do is to look at current distribution of health service access points, agricultural service access points, educational service access points, to see whether these access points are in areas where we don't have access to financial service points. In other words, what would be the opportunity of using existing access points, such as agricultural or education, to link that with financial access points instead of starting from scratch in areas where there are gaps in terms of the distribution of financial service access points. And then the third objective with the geospatial mapping exercise was to get a better understanding of how access to financial service points influences uptake and usage of financial services. So firstly, what I would like to do is to explore access to formal financial service access points. Think about access to financial service access points is or any access points, is that you have an access point in a fixed location, and that point has to serve quite a large region where the population is distributed continuously, but not equally. In other words, you have a financial access point in a specific location, but it has to serve a region where you have distribution of the population. In some areas it's more concentrated, in other areas it's much more sparsely distributed. So basically, if you then start looking at access, you have to have a good understanding of where the population is and where the fixed access point is to really start understanding accessibility. In other words, you have to have a spatial view of what is really happening. Up until this point, with the FinScope surveys and the supply side data that we had available, it could only give you a measure of availability. In other words, you would have something like, we have one access point for 10,000 population, or one access point for 50,000 population, or something like that. That gives you an understanding of availability, but it doesn't really give you an understanding of physical access to a specific service point. We need to be able to understand where the population is spatially and where the access point is. And another thing that is quite important to have a good understanding of when we start talking about accessibility is the issue of where is this transport system or the transport infrastructure, and also the telecoms infrastructure. It would have a significant impact in terms of accessibility of access points. So what we need, and that is why we did this geospatial mapping exercise, is have a good understanding of where we have access points, where we have the population, and how the transports and telecom infrastructures supports their the access of the population to those access points. Now, as a first step in terms of really looking into this this issue of accessibility of financial points, we started to look at the distribution of the population and the distribution of the formal financial access points in Zambia. So firstly, I would like to just focus on the spatial distribution of the adult population. Why are we talking about the adult population? Because a person can only access financial services or enter into a financial contract when they are older than 16 years or older. So when we look at the spatial distribution of the population in Zambia, we are looking at the spatial distribution of adult Zambians rather than the spatial distribution of areas of very low density. In those areas, we have 10 or less adults per square kilometers. And if you look at the slide, we will see that it represents about 75 to 80% of the country, the total population. And we see that when we look at this, that the Zambian adult population is very sparsely distributed. If you look at this current slide, we see that the light green areas represents areas of very low density. In those areas, we have 10 or less adults per square kilometers. And that, if you look at this picture, we will see that 75 to 80% of the country is basically very sparsely populated. So this does not make so the darker green areas, so sort of the medium density areas, are where we have 2,000 or more people per square kilometer, and then the very dark green areas is the very high density areas like Lusaka, the more dense urban areas. So, but this gives us a good understanding that it doesn't really make a lot of sense to distribute financial access points like banks throughout the country, because 80% of the country is very low density areas, which doesn't really make us a huge business case for putting a bank or a bricks and mortar, kind of access point in those areas. So, so looking at the distribution of the banks for as a first step, we see that on the map you will see that the black line represents the main roads in Zambia, and we'll see that it links most of the higher density areas. We have secondary roads in the lower density areas, and the higher density areas are connected by the main roads. And if we look at the banks, the distribution of commercial banks, which is the blue dots, if you look at them on this slide, you will see that it's distributed mainly in the higher density areas and mainly along the main roads of Zambia, which makes a lot of sense. As we said, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to put it in the low density areas because it wouldn't be very profitable for the banks. So if we start mapping also the ATMs, we see that most of the ATMs, and in this exercise and the geographical mapping exercise that we did, we distinguished between on-site and off-site ATMs. And in this slide, the ATMs are represented by stars, and you see that in most cases, the ATMs are actually located in exactly the same areas or positions as, or the locations where the commercial banks are, as one could expect. And there are very few areas where these off-site ATMs give access to banking services where there are no bank branches. And I have indicated those areas with names on the slide, and you will see that it's very few areas where off-site ATMs give Zambians access to bank services where there are no banks. So ATMs on its own doesn't really make a big difference in terms of giving Zambians access to bank services. If we now start including the bank agents, and we map banks, commercial bank branches, ATMs, as well as bank agents, you see that we still have although the banks and the ATMs are mostly along the main roads and in the high density areas, we see that it's still the case even if we start adding bank agents, but the bank agents are starting to give access to in areas where we don't have commercial banks and ATMs. So it does make a significant difference in giving people access to banking services. So although it's still slightly in the higher density areas, still focused in the higher density areas, we are seeing that it's moving into lower density areas and into areas where we do not have bank branches and ATMs. So if we now also start adding the mobile money agents, we see that now we are really starting to penetrate the low density areas. We have the banks and the ATMs represented by the blue dots, the red stars by the bank agents, and then in the orange stars we see the mobile money agents, and we see that now for the first time there is much higher penetration of the low density areas. One of the issues that we looked at with mobile money agents, we know that mobile money agents is very sort of not as sustainable as other access points. So when we did the mapping exercise, we distinguished between active mobile money agents and inactive mobile money agents. And this slide, you will see the active mobile money agents are represented by the blue stars, and the inactive mobile money agents are represented by the red stars. Inactive agents are agents that are no longer providing any mobile money services. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at accessibility and to see where there are areas where mobile money agents are not active at the moment. What we did when we collected this information about these access points, we did not only collect information about its location, but we also collected some qualitative information or attribute data with regard to these access points. And in terms of the inactive mobile money agents, we specifically looked at the reasons why these agents are inactive, and we saw that most of them were stopped being active because the agent was not earning commissions in terms of their own expectations. They thought that the commissions were low. They kept running out of float, so they had lack of float. And also there were areas where there were too many agents. So if we look at these reasons for why these mobile money agents that are inactive, if we start looking at those at the reason for the agent to be inactive and in terms of its location, we can start identifying where there are areas where there is too many agents. In other words, it's not really profitable for all agents to be in those areas, and we can start looking at that in a spatial context, and we can start analyzing that. We can also start looking at things like if an agent is inactive because of lack of float, we can look at those agents and we can start looking at the relationship between the location of mobile money access points and the location of a commercial bank, for instance, which would give us an understanding of how accessible mobile money agents or how other service points where they could get access to float, how these points are distributed in relation to mobile money agents, so that we can see where we could expect a problem of lack of float and things like that. So the geospatial mapping exercise is really contributing to us really understanding what is happening in terms of the mobile money agents. We have not done this analysis yet, but it would be available quite soon. For the purpose of the launch, we've just started with the initial top-line findings in terms of the geospatial analysis. So the next slide I would like to look at is when we look at the commercial banks and the locations of commercial banks, which are represented by the blue dots in this slide, and we now start mapping the microfinance institutions, which are represented by the yellow or the orange triangles. We see that microfinance institutions are located in exactly the same locations, or most of the time exactly the same locations as the commercial banks. There are very few areas like Chongo and the ones that are indicated on this slide where the distribution of the microfinance institutions are such that they make a difference in terms of access for the population in those areas. But most of the time they are in exactly the same place as the commercial banks. If we think about the objective of microfinance institutions, I think one of the key issues that for me, my understanding used to be that microfinance institutions were established to give people, especially in rural areas, access to financial services where they did not have access to commercial bank services. If we look at the slides, it doesn't seem like that is the case in Zambia. And if we start integrating this data with the FinScope data, which looks at the demand side of financial services in Zambia, we see that not only are banks and microfinance institutions in the same locations, they are also serving the same clients. If we look at the FinScope 2015 survey, we see that in terms of the main livelihoods, or the people that the clients that are served by banks and microfinance institutions, in terms of the livelihood, we see that 40% of their clients are people who are employed in the formal sector. We need to remember that if we look at the population of the adult population of Zambia, only less than 15%, less than 15% of adults are employed in the formal sector. Yet, almost half of the clients, 40% of the clients of banks and microfinance institutions are people who are employed in the formal sector. That means that they are actively going for the employed clients, those who are less risky for them to serve. In other words, it's people with a regular income, a monthly income, which they know would be able to, for instance, service a loan or things like that, would be able to save. So if we look at banks and microfinance institutions, it seems like they go in terms of the socio-economic status. Banks are tend to go for the more higher income than microfinance institutions, but basically both of them are going for those with employed in the formal sector. But if you look at the microfinance institution clients, almost 70% of them are already banked. And if you look at the reasons why those clients who are already banked use banks and what are the reasons they use microfinance institutions, we see that they use the banks to save and to get their salaries, and then they use the microfinance institutions for credit. They don't qualify for credit through the banks in terms of the amount of money that they earn, or either in terms of having collateral to get access to a loan. And so what we see is that banks and microfinance institutions are not only located in the same locations, but they are also serving the same clients. MFIs are more likely to be used for credit, whilst banks are most likely to be used just to earn and to receive salaries and for the purpose of savings. Banks are regarded as more safe by their clients for savings than MFIs. If we start looking at the other money transfer services in terms of the distribution of institutions for money transfers, and we look at post office and access points for Western Union and MoneyGram and organizations like that, we see still a concentration of these institutions in the higher density areas, and specifically along the main roads. We also see that the money transfer services in the post offices are in the same areas, in the same locations. Very often we see that the post office location is used for Western Union and MoneyGram. But when we do map the mobile money agents, we see that we get much better access or much better distribution, or in the lower density areas, for people who want to do mobile money transfers or money transfer services, who want to access money transfer services. So if we look at these maps and the distribution of the population and the distribution of the formal access points, what can we conclude in terms of access to formal financial institutions? We see that we have more than 4,000 formal financial service access points across the country, and we have defined geographical accessibility as an institution which could be reached by the population within an hour. That's debatable, but that was the definition that is mostly used when we analyze research findings in sub-Saharan African countries. And at least most of these population who access these facilities walk or use bicycles to access these facilities, and that is why the conclusion that we came to, that it's round about a 5-kilometer area that they go, distance that they can cover either on foot or by bicycle. So when we look at the percentage of the population within 5 kilometers of a formal access point. So what we did in this slide, you will see that you have a red line around most of the blue dots. The blue dots are representing formal service access point, whatever kind of formal financial access point. And the red circles around these points represent a 5-kilometer radius around these access points. So if we calculate the percentage of adults living within these 5-kilometer areas around all the access points, we see that almost 42%, 41.6% of Zambian adults reside within 5 kilometers of a formal access point. This is significant because if we compare that with many other countries where we've done similar surveys, and that I'm referring to developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, then this is very high. Most of the other countries where this kind of analysis was done the percentage of adults residing within 5 kilometers of these access points is around about 20%. So I think the Zambian figure is one of the higher figures in terms of. So, and I think one of the main reasons for this is because most of the Zambian most of the country is low density and people are concentrated in certain areas, and that is where the access points actually are. So this is I think this is a very positive picture in terms of accessibility of services. And if we look at these kind of services and these access points, what we also looked at is what kind of services could be accessed at these service points. And in terms of these 4,000 points, those who are also providing a service which could be used for the purpose of saving, in other words, depositing money to store it for later use, then we see that most of these points do offer that kind of services. So it's just below the 41.6. So 41% of Zambian adults reside within a 5-kilometer area or within 5 kilometers from a formal access point that offers a saving service. If we look at credit, however, this situation changes, because not all of these facilities that we looked at in terms of whether they are providing savings or credit services, more of these facilities offer saving services than credit services. So in terms of the formal access points where Zambians could access credit facilities, we see that drops to 584 points. The main reason for the difference in terms of the savings points and the credit points is because people are starting to use mobile money services for saving money or storing money. So the mobile money service access points were included when we started looking at access to savings services. But because of the fact that these agents do not offer credit facilities, when we only look at credit facilities, the number of points dropped to 584. And if we once again now generate a 5-kilometer radius buffer around all of these facilities and calculate the proportion of the population within 5 kilometers of informal access points that offer credit facilities, we see that this drops significantly to 34% of Zambian adults residing within 5 kilometers of a formal credit access points. As a next step, we explored access to informal financial service points. And in the first place, we looked at member-owned organizations that provide the members of this organization with financial services. So in the first slide, you will see the blue stars are representative of savings groups. In other words, this is a group where the members save. They can also obtain loans from this group, and also in most cases, the group also has sort of a social fund where the members which the members contribute to, and then in times of need of financial assistance, they get money from this social fund, such as for a funeral or in a case of illness or something. So it acts like an informal insurance service to the members of the savings group. In addition to savings groups, the enumerators who collected the data for the geospatial mapping project also identified other member-owned organizations that provide financial services to its members. These services would mainly be savings facilities as well as credit facilities. We are still in the process, or FSDZ is still in the process of verifying this data to see exactly what these groups are. Some of these groups are SACCOs, or savings and credit associations, and some of these groups are trader organizations such as farmer organizations, or just groups of specific traders. As we can see that this distribution of these informal member-owned organizations that provide financial services is quite it's spread throughout the country quite significantly, and it also is not only in the areas where we have not only in the densely populated areas, but also in the sparsely populated areas, giving giving the members of these organizations significant access, significantly increased access to financial services than when we're only looking at the formal financial service points. If you look at this map, we see the distribution of formal access points, formal savings access points, whereas which are the yellow dots, whereas the stars, the blues and the orange stars are member-owned organizations, that savings groups, as well as other member-owned organizations that provide savings facilities to its members. This gives us a good understanding that there is much better access to the informal services in terms of the geographical distribution of the population and the location of these organizations, and it gives us better understanding of the FinScope finding that showed that Zambian adults are more likely to use informal savings services than formal savings services because of the fact that they say they have quicker access to their savings if they put it in an informal, if they use these informal mechanisms. And we can see that just because these mechanisms or these organizations are closer to where the population is. If we look at credit services, we see the same kind of pattern, the yellow dots representing formal credit access points. The orange in this slide represents informal access points. And if you look at the stars represents groups that offers credit facilities or credit services to their members, and the dots represent informal money lenders or Kaloba. And once again, it makes a lot of sense that we see from FinScope that the informal access or the informal service providers provide them with quick access. It would be easier for them to get access to these providers than to the formal points, just based on the geographical distribution of these points. If we look at access to service points that offer insurance or protection, financial protection services, once again, we see the same situation. If you look at the blue stars, that is the locations of insurance companies across Zambia. Once again, it's mostly in the cities and in the very densely populated areas we find insurance companies. And then the purple stars represent mostly the savings groups and other member-owned organizations who offers, say, social funds to their members, which they can draw from in the case where some unexpected situation, such as a funeral or illness in the household, happens. So when they need finances to deal with a situation that they did not expect. So once again, we see from the FinScope survey, we see very low penetration of formal insurance. And it tells us that there is, the FinScope survey tells us that one of the key barriers to uptake of formal insurance is the lack of a value proposition. And if we take into account this slide, or the picture that is represented by this slide, the fact that so much more of Zambian adults have access to groups that offer their members access to social funds, this makes a lot of sense once again. Now, if we want to look at the distribution of financial access points, and we want to try and see where there are gaps, in other words, where do we have concentrations of populations with no access to financial service points. So what we have used geospatial analysis methodology that is based on the nearest neighbor. Say, for instance, we look at banks, and then we look at the distribution of the banks in Zambia, and we look at the nearest other bank in the area. And based on that analysis, we can develop potential catchment areas for specific access point. Just to make this clearer, if we look at this map that is currently on the screen, we see the density, we see the distribution of banks per district in Zambia. So we said earlier on, based on the density and the distribution of the population, there are most of the country where we don't see banks in this slide is very low. The density of the adult population is very low. So there's no real business case for banks in these areas which we regard as gaps. So just based on the distribution of banks, however, in other words, looking at two different points and looking at the nearest other bank in the area, we can use spatial analysis to develop the catchment areas for a specific bank, as I said. So if you look at the current slide and you look at the sort of straight lines, each of the areas within these lines are the potential catchment areas of the banks that are in those areas. So what we now see, if we look at that and we look at the size of these catchment areas, you'll see that is the number of adults who actually reside within that potential catchment areas. And you will see on the screen that those catchment areas have been categorized according to the number of adults. The red catchment areas would be where there's a huge number of adults per bank. In this sort of more orange areas, you'll see there's slightly less. So in the red areas, there's more than 100,000 adults per, 107,000 adults per catchment area, or per that is served by one bank. In the orange areas, we see between 49 and 107, and then in the yellow, slightly less, and the green, light green, 3,000 to 19,000 adults per bank, and then in the darker green, we see less than 3,000 per bank. The demand side point of view, the red areas is the areas where we have gaps. There are huge numbers of the population who are within a catchment area that is served by one bank, whereas the green areas from the demand side are the areas where the banks are closer to the adults and there's a lower number of people using one specific bank. So this is looking at it from the demand side point of view. If you look at it from a supply side point of view, it might be a different story, but just looking at it from the demand side point of view, the areas in red and orange are the areas where the population is large in terms of depending on one bank, and the bank is serving a fairly large area in terms of the surface. So the red areas would then basically theoretically be the areas where there are gaps in terms of service provision for banks. So once we are able to do this kind of analysis, it would be important to now see we have developed these areas based only on the distribution of banks. The next step would be what other service providers are in these gap areas. And in this case, on this slide, we have mapped just the bank agents to see are there bank agents providing bank services in these red areas, or the areas which we then have identified as areas where there's a gap or not enough in terms of provision of banking services. So we'll see that in some of these areas we actually do have bank agents that could deliver the services on behalf of the banks. There are, however, some of these areas that don't have as much in terms of bank agents. And what we now can start doing is to see, are there other types of providers, such as, for instance, educational service points, or agricultural service points, or health service points in those red areas, which could potentially be used to link financial services to, that would then address the gap, the so-called gap areas. Another issue for further analysis in terms of these kinds of maps, once we see where we have potential gap areas, is to now start mapping things like the transport infrastructure, to start looking at the network infrastructure, and also overlaying other kinds of maps, such as where do we have areas where there are nature reserves and things. So the more information about infrastructure and other data we can link to these kind of maps, the clearer the picture will become in terms of whether these potential gap areas that were identified as such are really gap areas, and what could be done. What are the opportunities to address the gaps in these areas? There are also other dimensions of accessibilities that we are looking at, and when we start looking at access and we want to identify gap areas in terms of access, we can't lose sight of other kinds of variables that has an impact. For instance, in this slide, we've only just looked at the correlation between socioeconomic status of the population and financial inclusion. And if I'm not going to go into detail about this, but basically what is happening in this regard is that if you look at the underlying map, looks at the socioeconomic status of the adult population of Zambia. The red areas are areas where we have lower socioeconomic status, so a higher proportion of individuals in those areas would be low income, would come from low income households. And the tendency here is that we see that the blue, in the green areas, we see that the bar graphs is likely to have a higher proportion of individuals in the blue and a lower proportion of individuals in the red bar. And this is the green areas are more likely to have more adults who are financially included, whereas the red areas are more likely to have adults that are financially excluded. So we need to take into account the relationship between socioeconomic status and financial inclusion. And we have to understand within the geographical context or the spatial context, where do we have areas of high proportions of the population who are from higher income households, and where do we have areas in the country where we have a higher concentration of lower individuals from lower income households, because that would also have an effect on the probability of them taking up financial services. And we have to understand that before we classify some of these geographical areas as areas of low or high access. We need to take this into account when we evaluate gaps in terms of service provision with regard to specific financial access point types. The second thing that we also have to look at is that there is a significant correlation or relationship between the socioeconomic status of the population and the type of financial inclusion. What you can see on this slide is a map that looks at formal and informal inclusion. The previous map that looked at the percentage of the population included versus the percentage of the population financially excluded. This map looks at the population who are financially included, but then distinguishing between the proportion of formally included individuals versus the proportion of informally included individuals. Once again, we map this on top of a map which looks at the socioeconomic status. Once again, the red or the more pink areas are the areas where we have higher concentrations of individuals from low-income households, and that we see in the red areas, the tendency is for those who are making use of financial services, they are more likely to use informal financial services rather than formal financial services. The green areas, which shows us the concentrations of individuals from higher income households, and we see that the tendency in those areas are rather to use formal financial services rather than informal financial services. So once again, we have to look at the poverty status across the country, and for specific geographical areas, we have to look at the tendency of those individuals for inclusion. Are they more likely to use formal and informal, or formal or informal financial service providers? And all of this has to be taken into account before we come to very significant conclusions about access. We cannot just base our conclusions about access or lack of access to financial service points just based on the pure distribution of the adult population versus the distribution of the access points. And then another issue that we would have to take into account when we start looking at these distribution of access point is to look at the livelihoods, the relationship between livelihood and socioeconomic status. And we will see here on this map, we just mapped the distribution of the formal employed adults versus business owners and farmers, and this is overlaid on a map of, once again, the socioeconomic status. And once again, we will see that in the areas where there's a higher concentration of low-income or individuals from low-income areas, we see that there is a higher concentration of people depending on farming or farming activities, whereas there's a correlation between businesses and formal employment and individuals that come from middle to higher income households. And once again, that needs to be taken into account when we make when we draw conclusions about access, because the livelihood and the way people earn their money and their financial needs would also influence the type of service or the type of service point that the individual should have access to. So once again, this is something that we cannot ignore when we start looking at accessibility to financial services and types of financial services of the Zambian adults. So we are still busy finalizing this analysis, and we are currently developing a focus paper, which we call a FinScope focus paper. The FinScope focus paper that will specifically focus on exploring the relationship between geographical access to financial service access points and the uptake of financial services. The FinScope Focus series is a series of papers that looks at different themes of financial inclusion that we focus on. So we look at the FinScope data, and we integrate that data with other kinds of research done by the FSDZ. So the FinScope Focus Paper 5 will specifically look at the FinScope findings and integrate it with the findings from the geographical mapping exercise, and we will then publish this paper, which will have a much more detailed review of the analysis and the interpretation in terms of access to financial services data. If you want to request access to the GIS data, please send an email to Ms. Betty Wilkinson. She is the CEO of FSDZ, and her email is on the screen. We also are looking at FSDZ at the next steps in terms of the way forward with regard to making sure that this database with the access point data is relevant and sustainable, so that we update this on a regular basis. And you will soon be contacted, or information will soon be disseminated based to give you an idea of when we will have a workshop with all relevant stakeholders to discuss this point of what is the best way forward to ensure that we have updated data on this access point. Thank you very much.